Good afternoon. And thank you for coming to our brain, the IT killing constraint we never consider. My name is Jeffrey Bafo Ampofo, and I'm from Ghana. And our presenter for this afternoon is David Burr, Managing Director for Bridging Business and IT, LCC. Audience, this is your presenter. David, these are your audience. Thank you.
Can you guys hear me? All right, so we got the first big hurdle out of the way. It's always a plus. Thank you all for coming. I know that this is kind of an unusual topic, so I appreciate it. One favor to ask of everybody, please silence your cell phones. I'm not going to be taking questions during this. I'm going to ask everybody to hold your questions until the end. This is a topic that we could probably spend a couple of days on. Luckily for you, we don't have a couple of days. We've got 1 hour. So we're going to be tearing through this pretty quick, which is why I'm going to just try and deal with the questions at the end of it. Now, as we get going into this, I got a really important question. We are in Las Vegas, so who wants to win some money? Good. I kind of figured I'd see that response. So it's a little, it's not really cash. It's 2 tickets for the Pac-12 game at 5 o'clock this afternoon, the Pac-12 championship game. I bought them yesterday. It's worth about $500. Okay, but there's 3 ground rules. Number 1, if nobody wins, I keep the tickets. Number 2, if the winner can't use the tickets personally, I get the tickets. Number 3, you play at your own risk. Okay? Ground rules set. Everybody got it? All right, here's the deal. You all know how to hold your breath, right? Don't worry, I'm not going to let you off this easy. It's not just hold your breath until you pass out. Since you were a kid, you've been able to tell yourself, stop breathing, and you were able to just do it. You knew your brain was taking care of your respiration automatically, but somehow you had an override switch to it, right? Okay. Well, we're going to do something similar to that, but it's not exactly holding your breath. I want you to stop your heart from beating. And the first person that drops dead wins. Are you ready? I said play at your own risk. So obviously it's a ridiculous setup, right? But before I get into the ridiculous setup, those of you that have managed IT projects in the past should have a vague sense of familiarity. And that this was a setup where the guy looked serious, but it was damned if you do and damned if you don't. You couldn't possibly win in this thing no matter what you did. Well, the point of highlighting that is there's a few things, there's actually quite a lot that your brain does that you have absolutely no idea it's happening. And we live with this stuff all the time, but we just take it for granted. You don't plan on breathing, but you just breathe. You don't plan on your heart beating, but it beats. One you can override, the other you have no control over at all. There's a third category of things that your brain is also doing, and these are things that you have no awareness of whatsoever, and you have no control over whatsoever. Now, I mean, for instance, you have no idea what your spleen's doing right now. Those of you that went out drinking last night may have an inkling as to what your liver's doing right now, but that's a completely different story, right? So there's these 3 categories of things that are going on. Things that you're aware of and can control, things that you are aware of but cannot control, and things that you have no awareness of and cannot control. It's that third category that I'm going to be talking about. And the reason I'm going to be talking about it is because these things are wreaking havoc on your enterprise IT projects. And we've had absolutely no realization that that was going on. We didn't know what was happening. So by the end of today, by the end of this hour, what I'm hoping to do is at least provide you with an introduction of the fact that these things are going on that you haven't been mindful of previously, and they're causing a tremendous amount of damage to your, not only to your projects, but to your organization, to your human relationships. A lot of these things are being taken as nefarious or malicious, and they're not. These are human behaviors that we all do. I'll be highlighting that as we go through it. Now, I'm cheating you to some extent. This is only an introduction. I wasn't joking when I said we could be talking about this for a week. Now, for those that are really interested in this topic, Here's where I'm not cheating you. There's a white paper at the end of this that I'll show you where you can go and download it. That will not only explain what's going on and why it's happening, it will also give you a solution of what the things that you can do to fix it. So with that, let's take off into it. So a question that I'm sure a lot of people would ask is, why do I care what my unconscious is up to? Now, the simple financial, one of the things I've got is a CPA. I was a CPA at Price Waterhouse. I am not a CPA, but I happen to have one. I was told that CPAs have hearts of feldspar. So if you approach this from the perspective of cold-blooded CPA, the reason you should care is because it's costing you and your organization a fortune. And you didn't know it. So let's get into some of the nitty-gritty of this. 70% of enterprise IT projects fail. Now that's the headline. The two leading academic institutions or empirical institutions that have studied this are CISQ, which is a consortium of Carnegie Mellon School of Computer Science, which is arguably one of the preeminent computer science schools on the planet. The other one is the Standish Group. CISQ has a failure rate at 70%. Standish Group, who interviewed 50,000 businesses, had the failure rate at 66%. Now there's good news and bad news. Those numbers aren't quite as bad as they sound. Only 20% of that 70% are smoking craters. Total write-offs, complete disasters. Now, Standish Group has that number a little bit higher, but let's just stick with the 20%. 50% are just way over budget, way behind schedule, or way under deliver. Now, that was the good news. The bad news is if the project is over $1 million, the odds of failure rises by 50%. So the odds of a smoking crater for $1 million project jumps to 1 in 3. The odds of a material level of failure rises to almost 2 out of 3. The odds of genuine success falls to 1 in 20. Now, just to put this into context, that means that the odds of playing Russian roulette with 5 out of 6 bullets in the revolver has better odds of success than running a large enterprise IT project. Now, McKinsey and Oxford University studied large IT projects even further, and they came up with something a bit more distressing. The odds of those projects going so badly that they threaten the very existence of the enterprise are 1 in 6. So the odds, so said differently, the odds of playing a regular round of Russian roulette is equivalent to the odds of what's happening when you're running an enterprise IT project in your business. This isn't good, folks. And yet we live with it all the time. Now, if we were to put this in hard dollars, this is also the CISQ data with a lot of input from IEEE. Do you guys know who IEEE is, the International Institute for Electronics and Electrical Engineering? It's a standard-setting body for software development for electronics. So CISQ found out, and they published this in January 21, that the total write-offs, the smoking craters, are $260 billion a year in the US alone. The cost associated with those things that eventually limp into production but never do what they were supposed to do is $1.56 trillion a year. If you combine those two, you're looking at $1.8 trillion a year in the United States alone recurring. We're talking about 8% of the US GDP. This is a big deal. Now, for the last 14 years, we have lived with free money, free capital, thanks to all the central banks around the globe and the federal government's pushing out stimulus money like it was going out of style. That spigot has now been turned off. So the things, there's a line that says revenue covers a multitude of sins. The revenue and the money are gone. We're going to have to get tight, and this is why we need to start dealing with this stuff now. Now, one of the reasons that the cost, when I started looking at this, I assumed that the smoking craters would be far more expensive than the things that eventually limped into production, and I was completely wrong. As you can see, it's 6-fold. The reason for that is because 50% of all IT staff time is spent remediating things that should have been done right the first time. Boy, there's an awful lot of heads nodding up and down with that right now, so you guys have all seen this. What IEEE found through a lot of their research is that if you catch an issue pre-release, it is 36 to 50 times more expensive to fix it then than it would have been to fix it or to catch it up front. If you don't catch something until post-release, it's 100x more expensive to fix it. So anybody who advances the argument, we'll fix it later, is financially idiotic. That dog don't hunt, to quote Bill Clinton. All right, let's talk about why this is happening. PMI's come up with 5 reasons, and it's interesting, almost all of the industry pundits are in full agreement with this. The universality of the consensus around all of these stats is amazing. So PMI says that there's no clear definition of what needs to be delivered or why. It's inaccurate and incomplete system documentation, failure to define all the project and operating parameters. Project teams don't fully understand what's going on. It's misguided and misaligned expectations. If you boil all of the research, all the pundits, all the academics down, it boils down to one thing. They never got the business requirements right. Again, an awful lot of heads nodding up and down. When you dig a little bit deeper, 75%, let that number sink in, 3 out of 4 of all these project failures are attributable to the fact that we didn't get the business requirements right. I'm not talking about specs like you have 5 significant digits in this field. I'm talking about nobody ever figured out what it was you were trying to do. They never got it straight. All the pundits refer to this as a communication issue. I'm concerned that that's a bit of a misnomer. This isn't a matter of communication because that implies that something was in fact shared. The problem is silence. The problem is all the things that are never communicated. And it really breaks into 3 categories. It's all the stuff that the business forgets, and I'm going to underline forgets, to tell the IT team. And just so that we know, I'm going to refer to as the tech team or the IT team, and by that I mean the project managers, anybody in the IT department, any outside vendor, and the business analyst. So I'm throwing that one big umbrella over the entire group, okay? The business never tells the tech team a lot of stuff because they simply forget. It's also all the questions that the tech team never knows to ask. And it's all the assumptions that they both make that they completely forget to confirm. This happens all the time. And what's amazing to it, I've been doing this, Jeff asked me a bit ago. He said, how long have you been doing this? And it's been about 40 years for me. And he said, congratulations. I said, what, on living this long? And he kind of cracked up. But the advantage of being passionate about a career path and having done this for as long as I have is you have the opportunity to witness an awful lot of companies. I've been in about 600 companies. I've worked in just about every facet of this industry. I started as an academic. I've audited this stuff from one of the final 4. I co-founded, built, and sold a software company. I've run national implementation consulting practices. So I have surrounded this from all angles. Very few people have that opportunity to do it, and I've done it in about 600 companies over the course of my career. After I've seen something 200 or 300 times, even I begin to detect a pattern. And there's plenty of patterns that go on with this. I'm going to show you guys a case study. And this is something that happened to me personally. Happened with a very good friend of mine who was the CEO of an early stage company. And before I start disparaging this guy, I want to make clear that this is one of the brightest people I've ever met in my entire life. He has successfully started and either taken to IPO or acquisition 3 tech companies. He was Ernst & Young's Entrepreneur of the Year for North America, and he remains on the judging board for the Entrepreneur of the Year award worldwide. I made it to the Entrepreneur of the Year for Orange County. So this is a bright, competent guy. He's a PhD engineer who went into sales, and he's one of the best salespeople I've ever encountered. So this is a bright guy. If this can happen to him, it can happen to anybody, and it does. So he was putting in place a pipeline management system for a new startup that had the unique facet that they were working globally. It was only because of his extensive career and his connections that he was able to do that. He needed a quick and dirty pipeline management system. So he retained this Microsoft VAR that allegedly could do it for 1 month and $20,000. 7 months and $120,000 spent with absolutely nothing to show for it. This friend of mine calls me up, he's ranting and raving, screaming at this VAR about how the guys cheated him and all the rest of the stuff. And after listening to this for about 15 minutes, he said, look, you do this, what would you do? I said, well, the very first thing I do is try and make sure that what the guy's trying to build is what you want him to build. Did you ever write that down? He said, no, we talked about it. I said, yeah, that doesn't cut it. Everybody's mind's eye is different. If you didn't get this memorialized on paper, you don't have agreement. Oh, okay, well, would you look at it? Yeah, sure. Give me a couple days and I'll get back to you. So I met with a vendor. Sat down. I spent 2 hours with this guy. Not an exaggeration, 2 hours. We laid out the horizontal workflow and we laid out the vertical roll-up of the reporting. That's the vertical roll-up of the reporting, which you've got up on screen right now. 2 hours. Everything seemed to be fine with the workflow, but the roll-up had some issues. He couldn't figure out how to deal with a corporate account versus a regional account. That was stopping all of it. That's critical. That's how simple a deal can derail a project. So, armed with my cheesy little diagrams, I called my buddy up, took him to lunch, and said, I want to get you out of the office. I want your attention. I've got the diagrams. I want to see if these are right. So I ran this by him. We sat down for lunch, and he said, yeah, that's exactly what I told him to build. I said, well, that's interesting. Tell me on this diagram how you would handle the difference between a corporate and a regional account. And he looks at it for a bit, earnestly. I said, oh, I can't. It's not on here. I said, oh, so this isn't right after all. So 4 hours later, of more questions, we wind up with this. At the end of the thing, I look at it and say, and again, this is a close friend of mine, so I can get away with this stuff. I said, you dumb son of a bitch, you've got nobody to blame but yourself. You told him you want the one on the left, you actually need something on the right. I said, this is my forte, and I have absolutely no idea how I'm going to engineer that architecture. I'm going to have to think about that one for a while. I said, and making things even worse, everything that you spent and all the software that you built, you're going to have to throw away because it won't do it. So we were back to square one. So there were a couple of interesting things that played out about this. Number one, it was a simple deal that killed it. Nobody ever bothered to memorialize stuff. Nobody ever bothered to ask questions. The other thing that killed it was that the other thing that was interesting is it followed a familiar failure pattern. The problem actually originated with the business, but it wasn't detected until the IT team tried to implement. And that's when the wheels came off the cart. The IT team wasn't prepared to confront the problems that they encountered. They didn't know how to deal with it, so they were the ones that looked like they'd failed. Now, that's not to excuse their performance because they should have known to ask the questions, and they didn't. This one simple example, we don't have time to go around the room, but I would imagine all of you guys have seen things similar to this. This happens all the time. It's the simple. Jack Welch used to say, it's the simple shit that'll kill you. This is simple stuff, and it's killing us because we're not paying attention to details. Now, at the end of this is about 15 years ago when this happened. At the end of it, I walked away thinking, again, one of the brightest guys I've ever met, how can such smart people make such stupid mistakes? Because they do it all the time. I would imagine you guys, there's enough heads nodding, you guys have seen exactly the same thing. Well, in 2005, Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book called Blink. Anybody ever hear of it? What he was beginning to talk about at that point is things that we were observing that we did not yet know why they were happening. And it was the behavior of experts. And he gave a couple of illustrations at the beginning of the book. One was a series of art experts that looked at a painting by some would-be allegedly famous painter that the Met had purchased for like $100 million. And they looked and said, yeah, something isn't right, but they couldn't put their finger on it and they let it go. Well, it turned out that months later, the Met had been swindled. It was a forgery. Another illustration they gave was a captain in a fire unit or in a fire brigade. So the fire department's in there in the building, they think the fire's above them. But a few moments into it, the captain said, "Everybody get out now." They had just cleared the room when the floor collapsed. Neither of these experts could explain why they knew what they knew. But it would have saved $100 million, and it would have saved people's lives. There are four things that have gone on over the last 30, 40 years that have really driven this change. Now, the first three are people's recovering from stroke, people recovering from traumatic brain injury, and the development patterns of children born with microcephaly. For those of you who don't know what microcephaly is, it is a microbrain. So you're born with a small piece of your brain. In the case of all three, medical science 40 years ago would have said they're hopeless, they're never going to get any better. What you've lost forever. Take that child, I'm sorry, parents, but put them in an institution, they're never going to be anything but a vegetable. Well, I happen to know one of the guys that was born with microcephaly. His dad, I'm going to be careful in the way that I treat this. His father's a very famous actor, and Dad wouldn't accept that as an answer. So they said, you need to put your child in an institution. He'll never be anything but a vegetable. Dad had the resources to bring him home and care for him. The last time I talked to this guy, he had just finished his PhD in neuroscience from the University of California. So that didn't work, right? The thing that has allowed us to explore what's going on is the functional MRI machine. Now, for those of you that saw 60 Minutes last Sunday, anybody here see that? Oh, you group, you've got to get out and meet the brothers. We've got to educate you people more. So 60 Minutes actually did a deal on Duke University researching dogs in functional MRI machines. Did you? Oh, good. Thank God we've got one. God bless you, so and the wonderful work you're doing. We're able to track how the brain operates from the individual neuron level. So we've been able to we are witnessing in real time how our brain functions. So we can have a stimulus and response and we can track it. And we're now beginning to do that with dogs. We have learned more about how our brain works in the last 20 years than we've learned in the last 5,000. And the rate of acceleration is exploding. Now, the reason for dwelling on this a little bit is it's not only the foundation of the 8 constraints that I'm going to talk about in just a moment. You know, we always talk about scope, schedule, and budget. The biggest constraint we face is the human brain, and we've ignored it completely. That's got to change. People are beginning to wake up to this, so you don't want to be slow to this. You don't want to be slow to this show. You want to get on board with this thing sooner rather than later. So some of the big things that we've learned, before I get into these individual constraints, I want to talk about this stuff. We used to think, and all of you were told this, that you were born with all of the neurons you're ever going to get. I myself, on Sunday mornings while in college, would wake up and joke with my roommates, well, there's another 20 million nerve cells gone, or another 20 million brain cells gone, right? You thought it was lost, and it was lost forever. Well, it's not. The brain not only regrows, it regenerates, and it redefines itself. It remaps itself. It reconfigures itself over the entire course of our lives, depending upon what we're being faced with and what we're doing and where we're attending. We never knew that. The other thing that's interesting, we used to think the brain was a collection of parts, like an old stereo system, right? That you had one thing that did vision and one thing that did speech and one thing that did hearing. Well, what we've learned is that's not true either. The brain is this generic pattern recognition engine that is based on 150,000 individual servers. And it quite literally is like an individual server. So it's redundant. So if one thing goes down with your hearing, it can be moved to a different location. The reason the children with microcephaly are able to do things with 10% of their brain that they weren't supposed to be able to do because they didn't have a vision center, vision has been relocated to a different part of the server stack or a different part of the server farm. Kind of a remarkable idea. We also used to think that we experience the world exactly as it is, that our eyes, our ears, we perceive exactly what's going on, and we take a snapshot, and our brain sees that snapshot. Well, I have bad news for you guys. That's not the way it works. Our brain assembles reality and presents that reality to you as a fait accompli. That the reality that is assembled is predicated upon your genetics, your personal history, and your environment. So those three interacting factors, all of which are going back and forth all the time, are creating your reality on the fly, which means that everybody in this room is assembling a different reality right now. It's hard to believe, but it's actually quite true. Now, with that sort of foundation laid, let's talk about the constraints. The first that I mentioned was that autopilot. I alluded to it. All the things that your brain does that you had no idea it was doing. Turns out that about 97% of everything that's going on with your body and your thought processes is going on in a subterranean environment. You never see it. And I'll give you a couple of specific illustrations. How many times have you guys been walking along and you were with somebody so they could witness it, and you tripped, you stumbled on a rock or a brick or something you didn't see, and your body flew into all kinds of weird contortions, right? You guys know what I'm talking about? You fly into all these different weird machinations trying to right yourself. You didn't think about any of that. That was your autopilot, literally righting the ship. That was the computer that lies beneath the surface that was figuring all of this stuff out and doing what you needed to do to be able to function. Now, it's very valuable. It allows us to do an awful lot of stuff without thinking about it. Its primary motivation, like if you're about to fall, the primary motivation of the autopilot is to keep you alive, and it does a damn good job of it. And none of us would be here without that autopilot having kicked in 1 or 2 times a week. May sound hard to believe, but it's actually a true statement. There is a downside to it, and it's a big downside. It leaps to conclusions. It never checks facts. It's incredibly inflexible. It's very often wrong, and it could care less. It cannot be corrected. It never looks back. Now, the real punchline in this is we don't control our brains. Our brains control us. Let that sink in for a second. We don't have the level of full mental autonomy that we've thought we had for 5,000 years. Now, I'm not going so far as there's a few neuroscientists out there that are completely off the reservation, in my humble opinion. Guys like Sam Harris comes to mind, who says we're nothing more than meat puppets, that you're a product of your genetics and that's it. That's all you're ever going to be, and every decision you've ever made was pre-programmed by your genes. There's an awful lot of people that would argue, vehemently against him, myself included. I'm not a neuroscience, but this is a fun area for me, obviously. I've spent a lot of attention to it. But again, I don't have the time to belabor this, but let me give you some illustrations to how this works, how this autopilot works. You guys see this checkerboard with a green peg on it, right? You see the slide marked A and the slide marked B? Which square between A and B is darker? Pardon me? A? Thanks for playing, but wrong. They're exactly the same. I haven't fudged this picture. I haven't played with it. All I did was take a screenshot of the A and B and put them side by side. Your autopilot, your brain, knowing that B is supposed to be on a white square, adjusted the color so what you're seeing, what you're perceiving, is lighter than the A square. This is happening all the time, whether you know it or not. Before we go into this one, and I'm not being facetious with this, pardon me? That is a shadow, and that's the reason it's doing it, which throws you off. If anybody has epilepsy, I want you to close your eyes or look away. I'm not joking. If anybody has a problem with epilepsy, do not look at the next slide until I tell you to. What do you guys see? Okay, do you see dots that are flashing on the screen? Yeah, this is a static image. This is not a video. you're doing this, it's not in the image. Your perception cannot be trusted. So when they say, who are you going to believe, me or your lion eyes? Well, there's some value to that comment. The second mental constraint that we deal with, and this is quite critical for us. This is a big deal for anybody in this profession. We need a mental model for everything. What we didn't realize until about the last 5 years, and the papers of all the research has only been in about the last 3, is that humans build mental models. Think of them as a hologram in your head for everything you know, whether it's language, navigating your route home, navigating a project, anything. There are literally cells within your brain that dictate the location and the nature of the object at that specific part of the model. Thinking is the act of moving from one part of the model to the other. So models are not optional, they're absolutely mandatory. If you don't have one, you're stuck. The reason you don't remember anything from the time that you were 0 months to 2 years about is because you didn't have any models to work with. You were constructing them. You didn't know what was happening. Now, why is this so critical for our profession? Because when we start an IT project, one thing that has become very fashionable over the last several years, and there's a lot of people that have pushed back on this, is we're just going to make it up as we go along. We're going to take a random walk in the wilderness and we'll ultimately wind up exactly where we need to be. Now, there are times when Agile works like a champ, but you wouldn't use Agile to build a swimming pool. If you are putting in an ERP system or a CRM system, or you're automating a process in your business that you've been doing for a long time, you need to build that model for the team, because if that model doesn't exist, everybody will create their own. And when everybody creates their own, all hell breaks loose. Not to put too fine a point on it. All you get is chaos. The need, the absolute necessity for that common model is imperative. I just have to laugh at this. One of the things that you're doing, you try and spend a lot of time on a presentation. I build everything on Mac. One of the reasons I'm standing here and not walking around is because I have to keep my finger on the keyboard. When you port it over to a PC, strange and terrible things happen that if you're not watching, your presentation doesn't go the way it's supposed to. We can't keep, this is constraint number 3, we can't keep all of the information that we need about a model in RAM, and I'll explain that in a moment. So we summarize stories. Anthropologists have known for 100+ years that every civilization on the planet uses stories to share, communicate, capture information. Well, now we know why. That's the way we are hardwired. We build these stories, and the narrative is what gets communicated. Now, the problems are these. The stories are very short. They're very limited. What is important is that the story is remembered, not the accuracy of the story. So now go back to that case study that I showed you. My friend got the central theme of the story right, but he missed everything else. When you're working with a story, from an evolutionary perspective, the only thing that mattered is that tiger will eat you. If you hear one in the bush, run. You didn't care about how much the tiger weighed. You didn't care how long the tail was, how many hairs and whiskers he had. All you needed to know was that sucker's going to kill you and get out of here, right? If you think about this, from another perspective, the world's changed a lot in 150 years. In 117 years, we went from first flight of Kitty Hawk to first flight on Mars. That's a bit of a difference. There's a little bit more complexity in that whole thing. The deals 120 years ago, the biggest challenge that we faced was hooking up Betsy to the carriage. That's not what we're dealing with now. We were never built to deal with the complexities, the branches, the potential, the multivariate analysis, all the stuff that we have to do in even the simplest IT projects now. So the way we've been going at this assumes a level of capability that humans have that we just don't. It's not there. So here's one thing that we have known since even before I was born. I was mentioning the fact that we've got very limited RAM. We can't hang on to a lot of information. A Harvard psychologist named George Miller wrote a fairly famous paper called The Magical Number 7 ± 2 in 1955. And this is not a literal statement, but what he explained is the reason why your Social Security number is 9 digits long and your telephone number is 7. You can remember 7 ± 2 pieces of data. Your stories are limited to 7 ± 2 pieces of information. If you looked at the first case study illustration that I put up, there were 7 items, or there were 9 items in it. He was able to hang on to 9 things at the outside, and he forgot everything else. Most people can deal with about 5. Now, before I leave this, there's kind of a critical and humorous thing. Remember I said that we create a story for every model, right? Story is a drastic subset of all the information that we otherwise know. So stories may be 1% of the 100%. That means our story is a gist of reality, right? If I'm the subject matter expert and a business analyst comes to me and wants to talk to me about the process I'm working with, what do I tell him? I give him my gist of the story. Now, that guy's doing the same thing, so he's working off of a gist of a gist. When he goes to the vendor that's got to code it, that poor devil's working off of a gist of a gist of a gist. And we wonder why things are going south. We wonder why we're having these failures. It's a big piece of it. So we're playing the telephone game all the time, and we didn't even know what was going on. Now, there's another part of this constraint. I love this piece, so I'm going to just spend a moment on it, because I still crack up at it. I may be the only one that laughs, but at least I'm having fun. Psychologists call these priming and anchoring effects. And I'll give you an idea of how they work. If I could divide this room in half and keep one side in silence from the other, if I went to you guys and said, I want you to think of a number between 100 and 200, and I want you guys to think of a number between 1 and 10, then I bring you all back together and say, tell me the number of countries in Africa. The people that I asked to think of a number between 100 and 200 would come up with a number about 50% higher than the people that I asked to pick a number between 1 and 10. Oh, that's interesting. Something is leaking over from one thing that has absolutely nothing to do with another, but it's influencing that behavior. And this happens in ways that we never imagined. So another one is if you're introduced to somebody for the very first time and you're holding an ice cold Coke when you meet them, you will think that that person is colder and more aloof than if you're holding a hot cup of Starbucks. My personal favorite on these is when you have somebody meet someone when they're sitting in an easy chair versus meeting them when they're sitting on a steel seat. If you meet somebody when you're sitting on the steel seat, you will think that the person is much more difficult and harder to deal with than if you meet them when you're sitting in the recliner or the easy chair. The psychologists refer to this as the hard-ass effect. Again, I'm not making this up. There are countless varieties of this, but we can't begin to get there. So let me give you another illustration. What colors do you guys see on this dress? I'm guessing some of you have seen this. What do you guys see? Blue and white and gold, or blue and black? Okay. Those tend to be the 2 color variations that everybody sees. White and gold or blue and black. I went through this with my wife this morning and said, what do you see? Blue and black. I said, I'm white and gold. We don't know why. It's your biases, your primes, the models that you've created in the past, your expectations for it. But here's the point I want to make. We're all looking at the same thing, and nobody's malicious, and nobody's being cantankerous, and nobody's being difficult, and nobody's being a jerk. But unfortunately, we're seeing 2 different things, and we can't help it. So the next time this happens in a meeting, for God's sake, write it down and get agreement on whatever color shade it's supposed to be, right? So somebody doesn't get blamed for doing the wrong thing. Mental constraint number 6. Remember, I say we have to have a model for everything. If you don't have a model for it, it doesn't exist. If you don't have a model pre-existing, if you haven't seen it before, it's not there. Now, this is the reason that humans suffer from the perpetual failure of imagination. Nobody ever dreamed that anybody would crash into the cockpit before 9/11 and crash an airplane. Right after that, nobody could believe we'd ever been that stupid or that blind to forget it. This sort of stuff happens all the time, over and over and over again. Nassim Taleb, if you guys read The Black Swan, Fooled by Randomness, any of these works, very low-key statistician, very humble man. I'm being wildly facetious for anybody who's ever watched this guy. But he's really entertaining. He refers to this as mother of all mistakes. And the idea is that what you see is all there is completely fictitious. Just because you haven't seen it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And I can think of countless illustrations where some executive says, oh, how hard can it be? Right? How difficult can it be? I mean, you do this, and this. It's because that's all they see. Just because they haven't witnessed it doesn't mean it isn't there. Number 7, the human brain's a computer. Different type of computer, but it's a computer. When I talked about the illustration of the server farm, I wasn't kidding. It has power limitations, processing limitations, and storage limitations. Now, that autopilot has a built-in controller, and it realizes that when one job is running and something more critical pops up, the first job gets killed and the second one gets prioritized. Which means just like if you had a power outage with your PC, with your computer, the data that you were working on may or may not come back. So the more stress you put people under, the more different jobs you have them working on, the more multitasking they do, the more inclined they will be to have rolling brownouts, and they're going to forget things. Remember, attention is a scarce resource. Now, I'm about to go to the next slide where we're really going to hope and pray to God that this thing works. This is one that we had the most trouble with. All right, everybody see the green dot in the center? All right, I want you guys to stare at that. Don't take your eyes off it, just watch the green dot in the center. And, of course, the mouse doesn't work. You just can't make this up. Okay, well, what would have happened in this situation is that wheel would have spun. That whole frame would have spun. The green dot in the center would have flashed in and out. I'm really sorry this thing didn't work. The green dot would have flashed in and out. The yellow dots, the 3 yellow dots that kind of form an upside-down triangle, would have stayed stationary. And in about 5 seconds, they would have started to disappear. You wouldn't have been able to see them. And the reason being is within that model, they weren't moving. Everything else was. So attention being a scarce resource, you were attending to the things that you needed to worry about. In the same exact way, the thing that was flashing, you kept your eye on. Like I said, I'm very sorry that one didn't work, but it is what it is. It is kind of funny when you go through the process of checking the slides multiple times and everything's supposed to be fine, but it isn't. All right, mental constraint number 8. We're going to spend a little bit of time on this one as well. The more expert we become, the more detail we forget. I'm going to say it one more time. The more expert we become, the more detail we forget. What winds up happening is there's an area of your brain that's right behind your forehead called the prefrontal cortex. Only humans and our closest great apes, neighbors, cousins, have this. No other species do. When you're doing executive level thinking, when you're learning to play a musical instrument. You spend an awful lot of time, awful lot of power, awful lot of processing, an awful lot of storage focused on that prefrontal cortex and learning the instrument. I'm a guitar player. I'm a bad guitar player. Not that I have bad guitars, but I'm bad at it. I'm getting worse with age. Something I've got going for me. But when I was learning to play guitar all those years ago, my autopilot realized Dave's spending an awful lot of time and attention trying to do this. He's sucking up a lot of resources in the process. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start moving the processing of that information. He seems to be earnest at that. He's going to do it for a while. So I'm going to move processing from the prefrontal cortex to a different part of the brain, down to the basal ganglia and the cerebellum. Now, for those of you who know anything about the highest level brain theories, the argument is that we've got the mammalian brain, the human brain, mammalian brain, and lizard brain. So we're taking it from the highest human brain down to the lowest lizard brain. What it does, what our brain does, is it literally lays down dedicated circuits. So from an integrated circuit design, it's like a system on a chip for any of you that are familiar with it. So we lay down these neural pathways that will do one specific thing and do it very well. So it has some great advantages. The more you do that, the bigger those circuits become, and the faster you can respond, and you can respond without thinking about it. Experts in an area can do things 3,000 times faster than a layman can, only because they've dedicated this information to a neural pathway. But here's the problem. When that information is moved, something called neuroplasticity, when it's moved from the prefrontal cortex down to the lizard brain, the autopilot is efficient. It cleans up after itself. It goes back to the prefrontal cortex and the conscious mind, and it wipes out RAM. So it clears your RAM cache. Which means the expert that formerly was mindful of everything they were doing now has no idea of why they did it. So they can do it very fast, but they don't know why they did it. They don't know what they did. They can't explain it to you, and they can't explain it to themselves. Now, for anybody who saw the movie Sully, about Miracle on the Hudson, where Tom Hanks played this character, you saw a bit of the story, but they didn't explain why it was happening. So Sully Sullenberger took the Airbus, crashed the thing into the Hudson. He went against Airbus's checklist. He started the auxiliary power units immediately when it was number 17 on the checklist. The Air Transportation Safety Board, Airbus, everybody tried to eviscerate this guy, tried to prove him wrong, when it turned out, after months of study, he did the only thing and the only sequence of events that would have allowed him to save everybody on the plane. He acted perfectly, but for 4 months when his life was on the line, his career was on the line, he couldn't explain why he did it. This happens all the time. Now, here's the irony in all of this. What's the very first thing we do when we run an IT project? And even that's a horrible title. I'm going to get back to that in a minute. But what's the first thing we do? Somebody. You guys all know this. Pardon me? Well, you asked to talk to the SME, right? You want to talk to the subject matter expert because we need to know what the process looks like. So the SME is the person that this is going to solve all of our problems. This is the guy that knows what's going on. Well, the reality is all he remembers is his gist, and we never knew that. So if you think about how this thing plays out, it's like an Abbott and Costello skit on Who's on First. I mean, it really is. I mean, what goes on, so the vendor or somebody from the tech team goes up to the SME and says, hey, I need to understand about this project. Oh, great, sure, I'll tell you about it. It's just do this and do this and do this. It's a piece of cake. And so, really, that's it? That's all there is to it? Yeah, it's really simple, not a problem. So the tech team goes away and they code the thing. And they're all proud of themselves 2 months later when they come back and they've delivered exactly what it was that the guy told them to build. He looks at it and he says, what the hell is this? It doesn't have this, it doesn't have this, it doesn't have this, it doesn't have this. He said, you didn't say anything about that. Well, you should have known. How many times have you guys watched this, right? It goes on every single day. So If you don't think this can happen to you, I invite you to try something. You've also known how to tie your shoes since you were about 3 or 4. If I ask you to document that for me right now so a computer could do it, there's some people rubbing their eyes in the background like, oh dear God, don't ask me to do that. You don't even know where to start, right? The most basic, the simplest thing on earth, and we don't even know where to begin with it. So I've already jumped ahead in slides. We know how these constraints play out. Like I said, it's an Abbott and Costello skit. It would be funny if it weren't so tragic. The problem we get into is that from a project perspective, this is what happens. Everybody on the project team creates their own model. They're all different. Everybody's just a reality is inaccurate and incomplete. We don't know what's going on, why. We're unconsciously biased by random factors we had no idea are influencing us. The SME will give us some information, but they won't give us everything. No one will realize what's going on until it's too late, and then we'll start finger pointing. The telephone game will run into perpetuity, and we'll try and fix it by doing more of the same, which only gets us to hell in a handbasket faster. The other downside from a people perspective is probably more tragic. You know, everybody in PMI signs up for a code of ethics. What we're doing is unethical. Not to put too fine a point on it, and I'm not being facetious. The way we are handling the situation right now is unethical. When things go south, we tend to assume malice. I'm going to speak of this a little bit more later in a few minutes. We assume people have done something wrong, that it was incompetence, that they were being diligent, that they weren't thinking, that they weren't being careful. You know, you've heard all of this stuff for years. You know exactly what I'm talking about. What they were doing was uncontrollable. They were acting like human beings. They can't help it, and you can't help it. And neither can any of the people that you're responsible for managing or working with. They can't help it either. We have to figure out a way to work around it. One of the best illustrations I ever saw of this, there's a book by Atul Gawande, who was a surgeon at Harvard, who wrote a book called Checklist Manifesto. If any of you guys ever heard of it? If you haven't, I suggest you get it. The Checklist Manifesto by Atul Gawande. He talks about how checklist entered aviation, something for those of you that flew to get out here. Every pilot goes through it to this day. In 1935, Boeing rolled out the B-17 before World War II. It was the most sophisticated plane in the air. For some reason, every test flight crashed. So Boeing's engineers went back and they looked and said, what was wrong? And what they were finding is the pilots had forgotten to do certain critical things. They put together cheesy little checklists of about 15 items. Set the flaps, release the brakes, turn on the turbochargers. Went on and on and on. And guess what? Planes stopped crashing. To this day, every pilot who ever takes off goes through a checklist. To this day. There's a very famous picture of Buzz Aldrin on the moon. You guys have probably all seen it. He's standing there in his spacesuit. Neil Armstrong took in his arms cocked up at this weird angle. You guys know the picture I'm talking about? It's resonating? You know what he's doing? Anybody know? He's looking at his checklist. Now, a little background on Buzz Aldrin. He's a PhD from MIT. He was the guy that figured out how to rendezvous in space. He was chosen not to be the first man on the moon by NASA administrators because he was so intelligent, he was freaky. They were scared of him talking to the public. He was just a little too esoteric. They figured the farm boy from Ohio, who was the commander of the mission, would be far better representative of the United States to the world than this guy that was the biggest egghead that they'd ever seen. They called him Dr. Rendezvous. He's looking at his checklist. If this guy needs a checklist to remember what he's doing, what do you think we need? So, forgive that little expression of anger, but my frustration is when I hear people say, we're agile, we don't have to plan. The veins begin to bulge in my neck. The guys that wrote the Agile Manifesto don't agree with that, and they're becoming increasingly vocal in their opposition to that, the way it's been interpreted. That's not what they meant at all. Now, finally, and believe it or not, 5 minutes to spare. Go figure. This is important because I've actually got those tickets to the SC Utah game, so I got to get out of here. Whew, that was easy. There's three reasons you guys need to pay attention to this. One's financial, and I've already touched on it. I'm not going to go over it again. The second one's strategic. If you don't do this, your competition's going to. The people that have gotten out in front of this right now, there's no going back. When their competition doesn't catch up, they get eaten alive. And that's going to happen again, particularly now as things get tighter. Revenue isn't there, free money isn't there, you're not going to be able to recover that with cash. The final thing is self-preservation. One of the references, and there's 2 pages of references for this presentation at the back of the deck, is by a neuroscientist out of Stanford who's a guy named Robert Sapolsky. Anybody ever read his book, Behave? No. Sapolsky's an interesting character. He looks like a hippie right out of Berkeley in 1967. He's got the mangiest hair and the mangiest beard you've ever seen, but he's a bright guy, to put it mildly. His book is Behave's probably about 800 pages long, but he takes an eminently difficult topic and makes it very approachable. So he's got chapters entitled Adolescence, or Dude, What Happened to My Frontal Cortex? Again, that's actually a real chapter. His footnotes are hysterical, so you've got to read those. I mean, I normally would not recommend footnotes. But he's got a story that he tells at the end of the book that he credits with one of his postdocs was finding. And in 1487, I may get some of these dates slightly wrong, so I apologize. In 1487, 2 Dominican monks from Germany wrote a book called Hammer the Witches. I'm not even going to try the Latin originally, but it's translated Hammer the Witches. It was the definitive treaty on how you identify and deal with a witch. This book came out shortly after the Gutenberg printing press, so next to the Bible, it was one of the most widely distributed and read books in Europe. Now, the idea behind it was pretty simple, and I'm paraphrasing. We can't have these pesky witches flying around the countryside, dancing naked in the fire and eating children, so you got to be able to spot them and deal with them pretty quickly. Okay, fair enough, assuming that there were really witches. The way you identified a witch was right out of the New Testament, right out of the Gospels. Jesus cast out demons, and the only reason that somebody is demon-possessed is if they're in league with Satan. So if you were having a seizure, that was prima facie evidence of the fact that you were demonically possessed, therefore you were a witch. Okay, great logic. That's bad enough, but the way that these guys suggested dealing with a witch was significantly worse. The only way to get rid of them was to burn them alive at the stake. So historians have estimated that over the following 150 years, something in the neighborhood of 100,000 people with epilepsy or other neurological conditions were burned alive at the stake throughout Europe for being witches. That's abhorrent to us today. Now, if somebody had epilepsy today, you'd take their car keys away from them so that they couldn't have an epileptic seizure in the freeway and crash and kill themselves and everybody else around them. But you wouldn't do it to punish them. You'd do it because you were trying to put guardrails around a process that nobody can control. Again, if something doesn't go the way we think it goes, our knee-jerk response is it's malicious, it's incompetent, there's something wrong with them. Fast forward 450 years, and you wound up with kids that couldn't read. And the teachers said that the students were stupid or lazy or incorrigible, right? Went right for the gutter, right for the worst. About 30 years ago or so, we realized there's this thing called dyslexia, where kids can't process words on a written page the way other people do. This is near and dear to my heart. My daughter has a very special form of dyslexia, and she is a wildly competent professional and successful professional today. But we spent years giving her tools, putting guardrails around a process that nobody can control, right? Now, fast forward to your IT projects now. Anybody who's been in this industry for a while has seen people ripped to shreds and eviscerated by management, by colleagues, by the rest, about the fact that they're stupid, lazy, incompetent, malicious. Price Waterhouse used to have an internal joke for it. We called it slime balls, based upon those keywords. It's all wrong. Now, I'm talking to you like a recovered alcoholic because 30 years ago I was one of those guys. Over the course of the last 20 years, I've realized it's not the case at all, and we need to change the way we do things. That's what I'm begging you guys to do now. Now, as I said, I've cheated you a little bit. I haven't been able to talk about the solution. But there is a solution out there. It's a checklist. And it's based on a model that you all know, but none of you recognize. You live with it on a day-to-day basis. You see it 24/7 in business, and people don't put the two pieces together. So if you go to that website, there'll be a couple places where you can download a white paper. Just go on, download the white paper. I don't have a lot of time for questions. Unfortunately, I apologize for that. But if anybody wants to talk, just email me. Yeah, Jeff?
We can have like 5 minutes for one or two questions.
Yeah. Does anybody have any questions real fast? Nope? Okay. Go to the website, Bridging Business and IT. How do we get the what? I couldn't hear you, I'm sorry.
Did it? Well, maybe I was the last one, but it said it exceeds the monthly scan limit, so it's not showing me it. I don't know if there's a limit on it, or maybe it's my thing. Can you just
I'm
send
not
it
sure
to me?
what that is.
Okay.
Thanks. Okay. Hopefully this is useful. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much for coming.